Excellent. Okay, fantastic. So we're recording now. So so watch what you say now. You're on record. So,
Okay. Okay.
I have a little question.
Sure.
How do you pronounce? Is it Grosseteste, or how do you say his name?
Gross test. Sometimes the second E is silent, but I say Grosseteste. Gross. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's sort of an English pronunciation, but I think there's probably an Italian name that he had before that. So I think he's kind of an Italian transplant, I'm guessing. I don't know that much about his family background. Yeah. But usually people say gross test or Grosseteste, I've heard. I've never heard Grosseteste, but it might be. So and I left as an optional assignment if you guys wanted to read it. Is his work on the secession of the laws, which is a surprisingly modern, take on an Old Testament question. Why did we stop doing the Old Testament laws? And so the problem with the question like that is it's sort of like, well, there's not really any one answer to that, and it kind of depends on which law you're talking about, and it depends a little bit on what you mean by stop. I mean, in some ways, we're still doing the old law, just maybe in a reinterpreted way, and so it's a very interesting question to kind of wrestle with. And so he kind of gets into it in some detail. And a good friend of mine translated that from Latin about 5 years or so ago. So it's a medieval work that's open to everybody now. And the Christian interpretation of the Old Testament is a very interesting thing to look into, especially in the Middle Ages, in which most of the stuff out there is only in Latin. So it's good to have a few more things to look at. Unfortunately, Nicholas of Lyra's great work, the Postilla, has never been translated. So that one, it would be one that would be great to have if we get somebody to get funded to spend a couple 3 years doing it, because it's a massive work. But it's I think people would really like it if it were out and about. And I think Nicholas would be more famous than he is.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah, that's sort of a problem that you have, right? That it never dawned on anybody that anybody would want to read this stuff, without knowing Latin. So I mean, that's a relatively new thing. Last 30, 40 years or so, when you have more lay people interested in this kind of stuff. So. And of course, if you guys well know, not even a lot of priests don't even really know Latin. So that's, we've sort of have gotten away from that. It's become kind of a language that only a relatively small number of scholar types know. So so it's good to either learn Latin yourself if you're really interested in this, or else, take a hope that someone will devote some time to translating this. Fortunately, all of Augustine's in English. Most of Aquinas is in English, but those guys are, only two of the most famous. So there's a lot of somewhat lesser known people who are also very, interesting too.
I found it interesting how strong-willed some of these gentlemen were.
Well, you kind of have the idea that the Middle Ages is sort of monolithic and everyone kind of agrees, and it's very collegial and stuff. In reality, there were a lot of, debates and rivalries and very much the kind of more rough and tumble scene, a little bit like you would see today in academia, where, there's a lot of, sometimes they're friendly, sometimes they're unfriendly debates between different rival factions. Of course, they're arguments that revolve around central points of unity, and maybe the difference is that those central points of unity are a much smaller periphery than they used to. But it's the Middle Ages is very interesting because there's a lot of theological diversity. There's a lot of difference in someone like Nicholas of Lyra, who we'll see next week, that Martin Luther was actually a big fan of. Martin Luther was a big reader of Nicholas. Nicholas was one of his key interlocutors when he wrote his commentary on the Old Testament. That was one of the main interpreters that he interacted with. He thought much more highly of him than he did of Aquinas, because his approach to the Old Testament was just a lot more, for Luther, was sort of less philosophical and more exegetically in a kind of a modern sense.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, but Nicholas is there. The Oxford School is a little bit famous too, but not nearly as much as you might think. They're mostly known for some of the bad things that came out of them, but one of the problems that happened too when we lost the Church of England, we kind of lost the whole sort of English Catholic intellectual tradition as well from the Middle Ages. So that sort of there's not really a organized group of people to really continue to push these writings into the mainstream, and so we tend to forget that they exist and that they don't become really part of the canon of people's instruction. Aquinas is, of course, brilliant, but, of course, Aquinas also has the great advantage of being a member of the Dominican order. And so the Dominicans are very prominent teachers even in our own world. And so they're going to be there to, push Aquinas' stuff and with good reason, because he's great. But there are a lot of other people who don't have, religious order who is there to really make sure that their top people get the same kind of press that other people do. So, yeah. So good. How are you finding the course, Sue Ellen? Is it making sense?
It's making sense. I'm enjoying it very much. I feel sometimes a little behind on my reading because I have to really think about it and really digest it.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it.
So it's a hard course, and don't be afraid if you fall a little behind in the reading, because I probably gave a little bit too much reading, to be honest, and I can kind of tell you how to prioritize it, as the weeks go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but obviously the lessons are good, because the lessons will give you some kind of window into what I think is important and what I think the central ideas are. I'm not, obviously I'm not going to quiz you on necessarily the nuances of the details of what Nicholas said about this or that passage or whatever. I'm just trying to kind of give you a more like a wine tasting, where you get a little bit of a nice sample of a lot of different wines that we have in the Catholic storehouse of, interpretive tradition, and you can kind of decide what you like and decide what you don't like as well. And the things you like, you can come back and drink more of later, on your own time.
Exactly. I've, kind of keeping a list of those. I was like, oh, wow, he's an interesting guy. I need to read more about him.
Right.
Yeah, I do like these lessons. I said that earlier, but I really do like them, especially reading through it a second time and highlighting things that I think are important. And I could see keeping this as a good reference for later on, too, after the course even. Right.
Yeah, so I kind of, parcel the assignments with an idea of giving you what I think is a good sort of sample of a lot of different things, and with the idea that you would, it's the beginning of kind of a lifelong learning project, so you'll kind of decide what you find the most interesting. Of course, when we get into the modern age, there's going to be it's going to get a lot more rough and tumble, and then you're really going to have to deal with some more hostile kind of criticisms and criticisms that are a little bit more difficult to deal with. But you kind of have to go through that to be able to get to understand where the conversation is today. And so, but some people really do like the Middle Ages the best, because in some ways it's it's a simpler time to be a Catholic, because all the smartest people in the world that you're dialoguing with, except for a handful of Muslims and a handful of Jews, are Catholics. So you're not you don't have to face what we have to face today. So in some ways it's easier, but You got to be equipped to be able to deal in the modern age too.
Right. I mean, the moderns is going to be, it's more like what I see at my Thanksgiving table with my in-laws.
Right.
They're all, Baptist. Like one brother-in-law is a pastor, he's got his divinity degree and he was a pastor, and the other one is just, no, we have this, and no, I'm not going to go read the history because if I do that, I'll have to become Catholic. And
Right, exactly. So,
the history with where everything comes from is so important to know all this development, how things got going.
Exactly, I agree with you completely. That's why I'm so excited I was able to take this course. It's great.
Right. Yeah, and the thing to realize is that the modern age, it's not as unique as you think, though. I mean, a lot of these modern issues that we're going to see are very much prefigured in the time periods we're looking at now. So a lot of the kind of modern questions are going to come up simply by looking really closely at the Bible in its original language, and then you start to notice little patterns, and then you start to see new things that other people in earlier centuries didn't see, largely because you've got more time in your hands, you've got better text in your hands, it's sort of like being able to see the sky differently because you've got a better telescope. We're going to see in some ways that much of the modern issues come about from that. But there's also a difference in philosophy too, and that can't be entirely ignored either.
Absolutely. I found it interesting you mentioned the lesson that many, and I think you mentioned it a while ago too, that some people just feel more comfortable with those who just the actual Hebrew and that kind of thing rather than just going towards philosophy side of it. And so that they felt on to that, to the philosophy portion, and I can understand that.
Right. Right. So if you look at someone like Hugh of St. Victor, or Aquinas for that matter, Hugh's very much looking at, very much the kind of Platonic worldview, the sort of mystical worldview, the idea that, there's a logos, and that sort of holds the whole world together. And if we know the logos, we have the infused knowledge of the logos, we have what we need to be able to interpret, the world and see God in it. And the same thing with the scriptures too. So that's why in his book, there's his first 3 chapters and all this geometry and mathematics and music and poetry and stuff. And it's like, what does that do with Bible interpretation? Well, that's sort of, how the medieval mind thinks. It's a mystical ascent into sort of a higher realm. Whereas, nowadays, it's the pendulum is swung way on the other side, and that, you're sort of, you might spend 2 or 3 years learning languages well enough to be able to read them, fluently in the original language. And then you'll even find once you get into those, texts and stuff, there's a lot of problems with the text, right? There's textual variations, there's missing words, there's parts that don't really seem to make a lot of sense in the original language, and you got to figure, I wonder what this was supposed to say. And so you get a lot of interesting issues like that, but it's kind of like it's a different approach. It's a much more scientific approach where you're really trying to gather as much information as you can, and going through every single word of the Bible and trying to nail it down exactly in terms of the original word. If it's a Hebrew word, the pointing of the Hebrew, so that the original word is, was interpreted correctly by the Masoretes, and what did it mean, and that kind of thing. And most of the words we know well, but most of the words, even if we know only 98% of the words, it seems like a lot, but there's still, in the book of Job alone, there's over 1,000 words that we don't know the meaning to in Hebrew. So what we have to do is kind of guess based on the context and stuff. And so, once you really get into it, you're blown away by just how much effort there is in looking at every single word in the Hebrew, every single word in the Greek. What does it mean? What's the grammar? What does it mean in the sentence? How do we, interpret the verse? So it swings to a much more scientific approach, and there's no way we can get away from that in this world because we're living in a very scientific and informational age. So I don't think we can ever easily go back to the world that Hugh of St. Victor knew, where, you know, the most important thing to know the Bible, Hugh definitely thought Hebrew was important. You know, he learned Hebrew, and that was a fairly unique thing for a person in his time. And he's definitely into original languages, and he's definitely skeptical of sort of the more wild allegories of origin. But at the same time, you know, you wouldn't probably have this really mystical approach to the sacred scriptures that he has, and you know, that's probably lost in some ways. But I don't know we could ever go back to that.
Right, because the historical is so important to even understand the context, which
right, exactly, and that's the other thing too. You know, it not really until the Middle Ages, you know, was there really hardcore attention to looking at, you know, what's the historical circumstances surrounding like these stories. Like when you look at a story like Ruth, and you look at the whole issue of Ruth having to find her kinsman redeemer at the end, like what's the whole, like, you know, Hebrew religious background to that? I mean, that's really something you have to know well, and it just doesn't do enough to say that Ruth is an allegory for the church, and you know, her sisters is a you know, an allegory for, you know, the old unfaithful Judaism or unfaithful Israel, because if you focus just on that, you're going to miss the significance of the book as it stands right now. You know what I'm saying? And so, you know, you have to be able to do the history with this. That's right.
You were telling about all the words from the book of Job that we don't really know what they exactly mean. If I remember right, from the prayer of the Our Father, the Greek word epiousios, that we really don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Do you hear much conversation on that at the academic level about what epiousios means?
Oh, sure. And I've kind of given you the main sort of interpretive options with that. The problem is it's what we call a hapax legomena. So it's a word that, as far as we know, is only used once. So either if our Lord gave the prayer in Greek, and it's entirely possible that he did. I mean, it is thought that he spoke Aramaic, and that's true. However, for reasons that are a little more detailed, we can talk about maybe later, I think there's a good circumstantial evidence that he would have spoken in Greek also, particularly when he's doing more public ministerial things. So that does not seem at all implausible for a Jewish rabbi in his particular period of time. But there's no way to know. But
wouldn't he have been reading the scrolls, the scriptures? Wouldn't they have been in Greek?
Well, that's a whole, yeah, that's an excellent point, right? So when he's reading when he's reading the scrolls in the Capernaum synagogue or in the Nazareth synagogue, right? So in Luke 4, Luke has him reading scrolls in the Nazareth synagogue. What language were those in? We're not actually told, right? Luke, of course, gives them to us in Greek, but his whole Bible, his whole Gospel's in Greek, as the whole New Testament is. So does that mean that they were in Greek? Were they maybe in Aramaic? That was sort of the common language of Jews at the time. Were they in Hebrew? That's possible, although that seems a little unlikely, because it seems like Hebrew at this time is more concentrated around the Jerusalem sort of priestly caste, rather than, you know, in Galilee or in and around northern Israel, where you're a little bit more into diaspora Judaism, and so it's a little bit you're dealing more with kind of a lingua franca kind of a model. So it's maybe either Aramaic or Greek, but you know, it's not impossible that he would have read it in Hebrew. But that's right, and so. So you're asking a historical question. So what do we interpret when we read the prayer that Jesus gives in to answer your original question in the Lord's Prayer? Do we start with the Greek, or do we try to back translate it to Aramaic? Well, we probably start with the Greek as a matter of fact, because the Greek is what we have. That's kind of what's been handed down to us. We don't have anything else that's different from the version. There's, of course, two versions, as you may know. There's a Luke version and there's a Matthew version, and they're a little bit different. They both use the term epiousios, but there's some other differences between them. And there's even a little bit of a, echo of it in Mark too. So, but yeah, so you're dealing with, in that case, a hapax legomena. So this word, as far as we know, is only used one time. And so, what did it mean? You can look at Church Father commentary, and they're going to be divided in some ways. You're going to find at least 2 or 3 different interpretations there. It's not clear that we can do any better today, though, because we don't have any separate attestation to this word. So so the discussion is kind of at a stalemate until we get new data, right? Now, if somebody if somebody finds a papyrus with the word epiousios written on it, right, and we see the word in an entirely different context, it's not using the Lord's Prayer, and so here's what this word can mean elsewhere. Could that meaning have been intended here? And so, that'll bust the discussion wide open when that happens. And there'll be a whole new round of discussions about, that does this new data mean anything? But as for now, you just basically have about 2 or 3 different interpretations of it. Not all of which are mutually exclusive, and maybe in some ways, perhaps the word is meant to mean more than one thing. So if you go into our library and read Raymond Brown's article, "The Pater Noster as an Eschatological Prayer," you'll find here that that there's probably a Eucharistic meaning of the term, that epiousios, that means sort of above and beyond what's substantial. So that might suggest something Eucharistic, but it also might be a reference to the Jews gathering extra manna in the wilderness so they wouldn't have to gather the next day on the Sabbath. Remember, they were doubling up that one day, so it was above what they needed for their substance on that day. And of course, those two meanings are not necessarily inconsistent with one another, because maybe the Jews gathering extra manna, the super substantial manna, is a sign itself of the Eucharist, So maybe God giving extra on that one day in preparation for, the new creation, the new created order, is itself a sign of the Eucharist, or a symbol of the Eucharist before it happens. But the point is that the word daily doesn't necessarily capture the Eucharistic meaning. And so, you're kind of left with, well, what does it mean? Is it bread? Is it Eucharistic bread? Is it my daily bread, just what I need to survive today, more substance? Or is it the bread, that I need for tomorrow? So something above what I need and beyond that. So those are kind of your main options, and there are probably some other minor ones as well. But that is surprising, though, right? That you'd have such an important prayer, and we don't know for sure exactly what that word meant. And so Augustine would say that, we have little things like that in the Bible to keep us studious, right? So that it's not quite so easy for us that we can continue to rest on our laurels and not have to study, and not have to really kind of rack our brains and spend time thinking about these things. That we really do have to sort of apply ourselves and consider a variety of options. But that's a good example of one. I can tell you elsewhere in Luke's gospel, it's kind of interesting. If you remember the parable of the prodigal son, so it's interesting. When the prodigal son decides to become a prodigal, the word, when he takes his things, he gathered them together, it's sunaxo. So sunaxo means to gather together. So for a very long time, we understood, and many translations will still say this, we understood this means to gather together. So he gathered together his things. He took them all with him. And I guess he put them in a big bag, we're supposed to imagine, and carried them off, and then became a prodigal son. Well, there's a problem with that, right? If he's got a lot of things, you know, you're not going to put them in a bag and carry them off. You probably, if you want to just completely disown the family, you're going to gather them together to sell them. And in fact, sunaxo, we come to find out in a papyri, there is a word that means gather together for the purpose of liquidation. So really, it should be translated. Maybe it should be translated. He liquidated his things. He sold his things, and he went off. Now, of course, it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of the interpretation of the story, but it gives you an example that we don't necessarily know the original languages. In some ways, we know them better than the ancients did because we have a much wider lexical background to sort of compare with. I mean, we can look at a whole range of usages, whereas they're limited to kind of the text they have at hand. But by the same token, you know, a first century person might know certain usages of a word that we don't necessarily know today. And that's, you know, the challenge to kind of recover that. And epiousios might be another term that's like that. You know, there might have been some other usage of that was common in Koine Greek in the first century that was just lost, and the church fathers didn't know it, and they were kind of left sort of guessing like we are, but maybe there really is another meaning to it that we haven't uncovered yet. I don't know.
We have situations like that even in our own lifetime where we've lost language, certain words in language.
Right.
Kids today have no clue what we're talking about.
That's right.
Correct. Or like the word mouse. Back in 1960, the word mouse only had one meaning. Then come with the computer in the late 90s, we got another definition for mouse.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So we've seen that in our own lifetimes where a word gets on a whole different...
right. Or the word gay.
Yes.
Yeah. 50 years ago, I don't know. When did the modern meaning start? I don't think it was probably not till early this century, I imagine, that you start to have a shift in meaning. And then...
I would think the 70s.
Yeah. I'd have to go do research on that. I probably didn't just start ex nihilo from the 70s. There probably was a slang or something like that, you know, if you were especially happy, you might be a little bit effeminate, and then that became to shade into being homosexual. So, and homosexual itself is not that old a word either. I mean, I don't think the word homosexual is older than about 2 centuries either. So, I could be wrong on that, but I don't think it's a.
I think you're correct on that. I read a book a couple of years ago, and on homosexuality.
Right.
There were different essays in there, and I think they brought that up, that civilization didn't even have a word for it until modern times. Right.
That's right. So so that would be one example. I'm trying to think of another. Another word in the New Testament that you see, there's you probably have heard this before. There are 2 words for love, right? There's the phileo root and there's the agape root.
Yes.
Okay, so now here's the question. Now, some people will say that there's really a distinction in meaning. I think that's dubious for another thing. But what I want to explain is that, like, the word phileo, the word comes from kataphileo, which is associated with kissing, and so that word tended to fall out of use in terms of when you wanted to get into more just the general aspect of love, and away from simply kissing. And so agape, for that reason, becomes much more common by the time of Koine Greek, by the time the New Testament's written, than the phileo roots. And that's why you have, there's actually a shift in meaning going on in the sort of period in which we're talking about. So, you have lots of examples like that of words that kind of change in meaning, or take on connotations that, you know, specific connotations that the speaker doesn't want to convey, and so he, you know, tends to not use them. For instance, you probably wouldn't use the word gay in the old, you know, non-homosexual sense anymore because the word is, you know, it's lost that meaning. That meaning is gone. Although 40 years ago, you probably could have gotten away with using gay in the other way. So it's similar shift in language. Yeah. So next week we get into the Reformation a little bit. That will be interesting. In many ways, the Reformation is like the Renaissance, but kind of putting the pedal to the metal, kind of on steroids. So you have a much more aggressive search for the original Bible, a much more idea of returning to what Nicholas of Lyra calls the Veritas and Radice, the truth and the root.
Yes.
And in some ways, that's really the very idea that's at the heart of the Reformation, the idea that by going back to the early church and the simple gospel, the claim is that what comes later, the Middle Ages, is not really a correct reflection of the original. It's gospel plus a whole lot of other interpretive stuff or practices or things like that have been added on and attached. And so in many respects, the Lutheran and Calvinist critique of Catholicism, we'll see, is not terribly different than the approach of someone like Nicholas or someone like even Hugh, believing as they did that we have to get back to the original sources and original languages. And so, there's a reason they believe that, and that's because, the original is pure, the original is uncorrupted. Whereas, if you're dealing only with, modern appropriation in your own time period, you're not really necessarily seeing what it meant originally, what the text meant originally, what the original church was like, that kind of thing. So that's sort of one of the things we'll wrestle with a little bit next week. And I don't think you were here, Sue Ellen, when I was telling Dwayne this, but Nicholas of Lyra was one of Martin Luther's biggest dialogue partners. So he didn't know him personally, of course, because he's much later, almost a couple centuries later. But he probably reads Nicholas's Postilla as sort of the generic modern commentary on the Old Testament more than just about anything else. So he's obviously reading church fathers too, the ones he had available, but Nicholas of Lyra is one of his big dialogue partners as well.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I was always impressed that Martin Luther had so many things that were still so Catholic, but then he had those couple of things that really
well, yeah, he was an Augustinian friar, so obviously, if you take a lot of his writings and just look at them without knowing who wrote them, you wouldn't see anything particularly non-Catholic about them. I mean, maybe like 95% of them, 90% maybe.
Right.
Yes. So his writings are going to look fairly Catholic in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Well, I think that's great. I look forward to that. But I'm really enjoying this Renaissance conversation too. It's good to go back and get a feel for what was happening. And
yeah, definitely.
Good, just Aquinas. I mean, of course, I enjoy reading Aquinas, but it's nice to hear about these other folks that had different spin and
right. And I meant to bring up Aquinas more in the discussion too, in terms of his idea of the literal sense and that the doctrine had to be demonstrated by the literal sense. That's kind of one of his key ideas. You can't depend on allegory to demonstrate a doctrine, because there's a sense in which that's not a real firm foundation if that's all we had to go by. So that's I think a kind of interesting view, and that's of course a little bit different too than the medieval poem, right? So the literal was what was written. What is it? The allegory is what we believe. Moral is what we do. And what's the other one? The anagogical sense is where we are going.
Right.
But I don't know that he would agree that the allegory is what we believe. That I think is what's different. Why don't we believe the literal sense, right? I mean, that's sort of a question I normally like to pose to classes. Why Why wouldn't we believe the literal sense, right? Why do we need to do an allegory before we get to the faith? Why can't we just believe that God created the world and that Jesus rose from the dead? And those are all true in the literal sense of Scripture, right? So why do we have to do allegory to get to the faith? That I think is a good question. Yeah.
I really think I was also a little bit surprised when some of them were kind of, pretty negative about the Jewish part because of the Hebrew language, just because it was from the Jews, and I was surprised that they're, that they were that negative about them.
Right.
Somewhat.
Right. Well, of course, that changes in the Middle Ages, right? So, so you're going to see that that there's sort of a tacit respect for Hebrew, Jewish wisdom, and Jewish knowledge that you see in the Middle Ages that you really don't see much at all in the Church Fathers, right? That would be a major blind spot in the Church Fathers. Jerome may have had it, but it's not even clear Jerome really learned Hebrew from a rabbi. It might have been from a Jewish convert. So, there was not, there's not a whole lot of, tacit respect that you see, but you'll see like someone like Aquinas will quote, Rabbi Maimonides, fairly frequently in the Summa. When he's sort of wrestling with what's the literal meaning of like the Old Testament law. Well, it would really be the Jewish rabbis that know that the best because they're closest to what the ancient, Hebrew practices were, whereas Christians have kind of, interpreted these in a different way. And so there was a sense in which people like Maimonides and Rashi would have been very appropriate places to turn to for knowledge of the literal sense of Scripture. And similarly, with someone like Nicholas, Nicholas has a tacit respect for Jews also because, it's not clear exactly how he learned Hebrew, but it probably was from, a Jewish person in Paris that he got to tutor him. And so there's a little bit of a tacit respect there. And I think similarly, you find that in the Oxford School as well, that, they don't want to be accused of philo-Semitism or anything like that, or sort of backsliding into, rejecting Christianity. But at the same time, there is this idea that Hebrew is sort of a mystical language, right? That it sort of has this sort of key to the, knowledge of God. That I think I quoted Beryl Smalley in the weekly lesson this week that Hebrew was like a telephone that you could use to hear the words of God as he created the world. I mean, it is true, of course, that the Old Testament was inspired in Hebrew, but I don't think we would quite say that the world was created in Hebrew, right? But nevertheless, there is kind of this idea that that's God's first language himself, and the way to understand God best is to learn that language. And so,
absolutely.
So there's a real respect for that you begin to see in the late Middle Ages, and you'll see it even more in the Renaissance, right? So someone like Erasmus, who we'll read next week a little bit, he would go so far as to say you're not really reading the New Testament at all until you read it in Greek, right? You're only reading, a translation of a translation or something like that, which, there's some truth in that, right? So
right. But some of that developed because of the Great Schism, where some people, that happened in like 1,000 and something.
Yeah, right. So right. So that's sort of an interesting discussion in itself. But yeah, one of the problems is that the quality of text that someone like Thomas Aquinas would have had to work with would just were not that good in terms of just the literal accuracy. The translational choices that Jerome made, there's really no ability that someone like Aquinas would have to evaluate, whether the Latin Vulgate was really on every particular word that's being interpreted, whether it really was a good translation of the Greek original. there's also textual problems too. I mean, if you copied on any text, repeatedly, dozens and dozens of times throughout the centuries, little mistakes are going to creep in, and you're going to have a text that by the time the Middle Ages rolls around, it's like, well, you start to see, some of the guys complaining, like in the School of Paris and stuff. Are these texts really even that accurate? Could we do any better than these? Can we be a little bit more precise and nailing down what this original text was? And so you do see some attempts to sort of fix the problems of the Vulgate. There was sort of a standard. They eventually developed a standard University of Paris sort of official copy of the Bible, which was sort of the best that they could do with what they had at the time. And for guys like Nicholas of Lyra, that even that wasn't good enough, because it still is different in some respects than the Greek text that they had originally. And so I can't remember this week, did we look at did we talk about the Complutensian and Polyglot at all, and the Bible done in 4 languages? I can't remember.
That was mentioned.
Yeah, right. So that was the reason, of course, that comes about is that people are beginning to say, well, look, here, what we really need is to systematize this. It's not going to work having some guys working in translation, some guys working over the original text, but everyone working with versions that are slightly different. Really what we need to do is kind of standardize, the Bible that we're looking at. In other words, very much kind of what we would want today, right? Where we kind of have sort of one official team of scholars that, for decades and decades and decades will sort of come up with the official kind of scholar's Bible that sits behind all the vernacular translations. That's kind of one of the felt needs that they had, even in the the 16th century or so, even before the Reformation. So the Complutensian Polyglot was one of the ways in which they kind of addressed that, just looking at a real rigorous side-by-side, verse-by-verse, word-by-word comparison. So, the scholars who at least did know the original languages would be able to, to come up with, a better way of, nailing down a more precise, interpretation of the text. So all this is very important. It maybe gets a little bit tedious, but, there's a lot of, the Bible is, God made it hard for a reason, maybe because, he wanted people to really work at it. And so you begin to see the felt need of being able of really, providing the tools of doing all the rigorous work, that beginning in really the early Renaissance, even before the Reformation.
Really interesting.
Yeah. So
If only we all had time that we could sit there and do that, but thank goodness there's somebody out there that's willing to.
Right, exactly. Here's the thing, right? Just like with knowledge in any field, right? What do you do for a living, Sue Ellen?
I am a substitute teacher at this point.
Okay.
I used to veterinary supplies for 28 years.
What did you do?
I sold veterinary supplies for 28 years.
Okay, sure. Well, veterinary knowledge, how much knowledge is there in how to treat a sick dog? I mean, there's probably, thousands and thousands of people sort of involved in that knowledge that's been accruing over the decades, and all the publications and the tests and the trials of the drugs and all those kinds of things, right? So, every one of us is sort of dependent on, riding the crest of other people's brains and effort. I mean, that's sort of one of the facts of the world we're living in. And the Bible's no different at all. I mean, if you walk into a biblical library, I mean, you'll be, maybe you won't be, but the Bible's the most researched book ever in history. And so you'll be amazed how much, stuff there is just on, say, the book of Matthew, right? There's a whole library just on the book of Matthew. There's a whole library just on the Gospel of John. All these language tutorials, all the concordances, the word studies, the commentaries, the historical work, the different sort of interpretive techniques, the history of interpretation. all these kinds of things. I mean, it's truly mind blowing how much work has been done on this single book, and we might be living in a secular age, but I don't think that necessarily that's diminished the interest in the Bible. What I think has really happened is it's channeled the effort in new directions, so that there's always going to be new approaches to interpretations, and nailing down the text is an ongoing project that will never be done. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of mind blowing.
Is there a place in the U.S. where they have a Bible library like that, or would you have to go to Europe?
Yeah. So where do you live?
I live in Texas.
Oh, what part?
I live right in the heart of Texas, the geographical center of Texas.
Like Austin?
Pardon?
Like Austin?
About 2 hours west of Austin.
West of Austin. Okay. Well, if
Yes, sir.
you're near a seminary of any kind, a Catholic or even like a mainline Protestant one, or
Yes.
even like a major state university, just walk in there and look in the BS section and see how
Okay.
many things there are, just for fun. And you probably want to do that
Wow.
anyway when you're doing your paper, right? So,
Right.
yeah, if you're near, what city do you live in?
I live in Brady. It's about 5,000 people, but I'm about 2.5 hours from San Antonio and about 2 hours
Okay,
or so
yeah.
from Austin.
Like San Antonio would have, you have no trouble finding in San Antonio. Yeah.
I lived in San Antonio for 15 years.
Yeah, I love San Antonio. I was just down there last year for the Biblical Studies Conference.
Wow. Where did they hold that?
It was at a couple hotels in downtown San Antonio. It's in a different
I
place
see.
every year. It's a Society of Biblical Literature. It'll be in I think it'll be in Denver this year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That'd be great, too.
Yeah.
I was there once, so.
If you're interested in Bible and you have money, it'll cost you a couple $100 or so to get the pass and stuff. But yeah, check it out. You can go and sit and listen to talks and stuff and ask people questions and everything.
That'd be really interesting.
I've got 7:30 now, and I think I'm going to log off. I've got
Okay,
some things
yeah.
to do tonight. So
Okay,
I sure
that's fine.
appreciated
It
this.
is about 8:30 now. Do you want to ask anything else, Sue Ellen, before we go?
No, sir. I'm fine. I really enjoyed getting to
Okay,
talk with
sure.
you.
We'll try to do this again in maybe a week or two more.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
That's
good
Okay.
idea.
great.
All right.
Great.
Good night,
Okay.
everyone. Have a nice
Good-
day.
Thank you, and
Good
good night
night.
now.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.